Okay. I'd like to start the regular board meeting for Monday, July 1st. Let's do a roll call. Commissioner Andrews,
Present.
Commissioner Perez,
Hello.
Commissioner Burgess,
Present.
Commissioner Manzel,
Present.
and Commissioner Trainer.
I'm here. Hello.
Okay, thank you. I know joining, it was hard. Okay, at this point, do we have any public comment? I don't think we do that. Doesn't sound like it. Are there any communications?
No communication. So,
Perfect. Then that moves us to the executive director's report for park district updates and the Ben Young updates. So you have the floor.
so I sent everybody out a quick briefing Friday, and so I'll be following that up with a phone call. And then we've been talking about doing some training with everyone on a regular basis. So this is, I would say, like the first of the many trainings that we're going to be doing. And we have a couple big projects that we're working on that we thought this would be a great opportunity to kind of get everybody up to speed on it. Jason and I have been living in the Park District project for quite a while now, and we have the final meeting coming up on July 10th with the Everett City Council. That hopefully we're going to end up with a positive vote that night. So with that, we're going to start off with the Park District project and do a quick slideshow and then answer any questions that you may have. The several changes that have happened in this project since some of you may have been updated on it. And so we'll go through those changes. There's been a lot of work that has occurred with the neighborhood association and with the city of Everett. I spent quite a bit of time talking to each one of the council members. And basically every outside group that I could think to talk to about it. And based on some of those discussions and then discussions with city of Everett staff, there's been several tweaks to this project that have got it into a pretty good place as far as the neighborhood is concerned. And I believe both Chip and Cynthia were at the neighborhood meeting that we had, and it actually was a really good meeting. It was kind of fascinating where some of the neighbors were actually arguing some of our points in the meeting. So that was actually a really good thing to see. So and I've actually got to a point where I really enjoy working with these folks. They're really passionate about their neighborhood and they want to make sure that whatever, they're not opposed to this project at this point. They just want to make sure that it's done properly and that it meets the needs of the neighborhood, which, you know, you can't fault anybody for that. So with that, I'm going to have Jason go ahead and start our presentation, and we'll both kind of we'll do a tag team on it.
Good afternoon, commissioners. So I'm going to there's quite a lot of slides here. I'm going to run through them fairly quickly. Feel free to stop me if you have a question in between, or we can definitely run back through the slides again after it's over in a Q&A. So I'll leave it up to you to how we want to run through this exchange. But from my perspective, what I'm trying to do is run through the Park District and also run through Ben Young, just give a pretty kind of high level overview, and then speak to a couple what I think are significant things that should be understood from your perspective, and also just some information share on where we're at in terms of progression on both projects. So I'll start with the Park District. This is a rendering of the future Park District. It shouldn't be understood as kind of the final architecture of the Park District, but it's a best look at what it will look like prior to us really designing any of the particular buildings. I think a few things here are very important to kind of take away. One, especially as relates to what has been the public's largest concern, which has been height. There's a few things that I think should be understood. One is, if you take a look at The hospital at 192 feet. If you take a look at the future, that red line that says future 15-story buildings on Broadway, that relates to the future comprehensive plan. And so part of the comprehensive plan, which sets zoning really for the next decade, will most likely establish basically 15-story buildings in terms of zoning capacity all the way through Broadway and really through almost all of the major arterials in Everett. So that means Broadway, that means up Evergreen and Rucker, and any kind of large arterial pathways. Those are the places whereby the city, under their current planning paradigm, think that most of the units can come. I will quickly jump onto the total kind of supply account that the city needs, because that's a very important part of the picture. But as relates to this particular rendering and the architecture, the important thing to recognize is this is a reflection of a project that's, let's say 15 years out from total completion. And so the thing to keep in mind, which is difficult, is that what we know about that neighborhood is not necessarily what those neighborhoods will be in 15 years. And then another discussion point is when we're talking about PDO, we're not talking about the built structures. We're talking about a development capacity in a zoning envelope, which is really just what is the 3D envelope in which those buildings can live within. And so when you think of it in a zoning capacity context, the height's a little less scary because there's a lot of precedent height, whether it's Bakerview that already pre-exists, or it's the hospital, or it's the 15-story zoning infrastructure that's going to exist on Broadway. It's really not as dramatic as it may otherwise seem. That being said, I'm not going to suggest this isn't a big project or that the scale and height isn't something for folks to consider. And certainly if you live in that neighborhood and are used to a different environment, this certainly is a big change. And so the other thing that I think is really important just to recognize is the architectural sophistication of the design. We have a very strong design team. They thought very deeply about this. What you really can't see in this rendering is the large gradient slope change from the bottom to the top, which is very significant. And while that works as a disadvantage in some cases in terms of it adds complexity, what it does is create a dynamic architectural environment in which the heights kind of play at each other. And if you look at all these heights, one of the things the rendering does a good job of is illustrating the various height differences between all the buildings. So it's not some monotone super block, but it's kind of a fairly sophisticated interplay of heights, which both is advantageous from the street level, but it's also very advantageous for the residents who are living in those buildings.
And I might add to that, this became a really pivotal point in the discussion with the neighborhood. Because you can, first of all, we were at 15 stories and we've dropped it to 12. But then when you could actually see the relationship of the building height to what the hospital height is currently, it gave some perspective. And, Councilmember Fossey actually, there had been some diagram out there that somebody had done that everybody kept referring to. And she had suggested that we do something that really kind of show it in real life. And I think that this slide actually gave everybody a visual that made sense. That wasn't like all these just big stories with no design to it or anything. The other thing that became really obvious to me, I've driven around this area a lot, and the topography of that area it's not all flat. And so how it terraces down makes it a really unique piece of property. And I think talking about that and explaining that made a huge difference. And then the other thing is that park in the middle is like 1.5 acres. So that's pretty significant. And then the parking underground, which also adds some significance to this project.
So this just gives another graphic display, just site layout, in particular, just showing the focus from the very beginning of my initiation at the Park District. One of the community's requests and demands was that there be a lot of open space, which was reflected in the 1.5 acre park. And I think important for commissioners to understand as part of doing that and responding to that, A is bringing enough massing and height to enable that, but the other one is to park underground, which is a very significant investment on the Housing Authority's part to respond to the community. Really, it was one of the very first moves to kind of respond to the community's request for parks and for a kind of civic core / retail core that the neighbor can meet. And in doing so, you know, you need to solve a fairly large puzzle. And, you know, the conclusion of that puzzle is that we have a beautiful 1.5 acre park in between fairly large building structures. But we also have established a new kind of neighborhood retail core, for which we already have Bezos. If you see the early education space, that's the Bezos Academy space. Childcare space is the YMCA space. Cafe and radio station is the LOI we have with KSER. Art Center is a shacks roughly around 1,000 square feet satellite space, so that they now can have a full-time presence in Delta. And then the library, community center space, and the retail don't have tenants, but those spaces are allocated for those uses. And then you can see across the street to the north, retail for what will be the next phase, to the west, so that there is a core street there, Hemlock, which basically is a retail street that's activated both by vehicular traffic, but also by pedestrian civic movement, as well as the retail playing off each other. And so this is has been a very large part of the puzzle in which the designers needed to respond to. There has been in council a fair amount of conversation about empty retail. From our perspective, we're not very concerned about retail. Most of the civic space is already filled up, in the sense we already have LOIs with future tenants. But we do have some spaces that we'll still need to fill. But we do have, you know, 2.5 years, depending on what the length of the development as well as the construction time is, to basically find folks to fit that space and to activate that space. I think from my perspective, more pertinent and something just for us to manage, and something commissioners should know, is just thinking about all this in a phasing, in the sense that this first phase will go first. The rest of the demolition will already occur, which means you'll have a lot of parking and a lot of grass space for several years before it gets filled out. And as we work through the progression of working through the phases, we'll slowly be filling out those phases. And so some of the concerns about traffic and parking really won't occur for many, many years down the road until it's fully built out. And at the same time, the retail will do much better once the second phase is built across the first phase. So there's a full street of retail, which is one reason why we've worked so early on to create as many kind of civic partners as we can. So that most of the space is already occupied, and the focus on filling the other retail space is really limited to a few thousand square feet, which is both reasonable and something that our retail consultant is pretty confident that we can resolve. Oh, Commissioner Andrews?
Yeah, have we any connection with marketplace such as grocery stores, small grocery stores that we can hopefully partner with to provide food? Because we know the closest grocery store is Safeway, and I think it would reduce traffic if we had something that was local that the community could walk to.
So in the early stages of design, we really wanted there to be a larger grocery present, which is where that childcare space is on the corner. The retail consultant strongly advocated against it, saying there was absolutely no marketplace for a larger grocery establishment, because it's not on an arterial, and it's not really within. Also, from their perspective, even though Safeway is a distance away, the radius in which Safeway covers more than covers this area. And so from the kind of retail market analytics perspective, our retail consultant, who has a lot of experience with groceries, strongly advocated against us providing any large grocery space. She did suggest that
I wasn't considering large grocery store. I was a marketplace, a neighborhood market where people can.
So we were looking at roughly around 10,000 square feet. Approximately as a larger space type, what she suggested is maybe 2,000, 3,000 square feet would be something that would be possible.
Yeah, I think that that's something that, you know, as we progress on, makes some sense there, so. You know, we'll look at that. I think a small little grocery store does make some sense in that area. There's an area that I was in, that had a, Amazon Go, store. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, but it's where you can actually have, your Amazon packages delivered. And it also is kind of a small little store, also that you can go in and get certain things. You know, this could be something that would work really well in this area.
It might be a little expensive for
Yeah.
our clients.
It could, well,
Yeah.
however, remember, this is a cost-based housing. So this isn't all low-income housing. So this development really, has a potential, and I think real potential of changing the whole character of that area. So it will really bring in some mixed uses, whether an Amazon Go is the right match there, who knows? But I think something similar to that makes a heck of a lot of sense.
Excuse me, may I interject? I think that it would be important for us to be committed to our small business, small business, minority owned or women business. I think we need to make space for that and show that we are committed to those communities. And so I would suggest we do something that's more local, that we can invest in the local people in the community, as opposed to bringing in something like Amazon. It's just a
Yeah,
thought.
we can, that's a good thought, Cynthia.
Any other questions before I move on slides?
Of the people of our clients who live in this particular area as a whole. Have you had any comments from them, and if so, what were?
Yeah, so when we first started working on this, George, we had several community meeting groups, of which we had large groups of Everett Housing Authority residents come participate. Really, really broad. I can actually send out again the survey that came from it, but I would say in general, especially as relates to the retail conversation, for folks who were living within EHA properties, there was a strong request for like discount stores. So there was feedback in that. There was generally a request that not all of the establishments were priced out of their ability to kind of participate in those spaces. So that is something we took seriously. And one of the rationales for kind of the cafe radio station spaces is so that there was a space that was we could create a space that was able to provide kind of the location for social engagement for a lot of people, whether it's our residents or the rest of the community, but be kind of on a lower threshold in terms of economic threshold to just be able to buy a cup of coffee or buy a tea or what have you and still participate. So that's been part of the thinking. That's the same rationale for why we have the art center there. But we still have a lot of other pieces to fill. And for the most part, a lot of these retail spaces will not really be filled until we actually get the physical space up and the retailers can take a look at the space. And so there's still a lot of work to be done, but we also need a lot of progression to take place before we can have much more serious conversations about which retailers fill which spaces that aren't already filled by our civic partners.
Have we spoken with any of these retailers? And just, say hypothetically, hey, we're building this place. Would you be interested in coming?
We've had certain conversations, and we also have a retail consultant that's extremely experienced in that. And when you talk to retail consultants, they will tell you you're wasting your time until you get a physical space.
Okay.
I'm not suggesting that that's the only way to go about it, and we have reached out to some others, but in general, that's my experience as well. Retailers don't want to talk to you until they can see a physical space. They know what's there, especially when you're talking smaller neighborhood retail. So we will continue, and that will certainly be my focus as we move forward, is to spend a lot more time on trying to curate and make sure that these retail spaces are the tenants that we want. also kind of fit our own economic variables, because there are some things we need to take into account. It's definitely preferable from our perspective to have tenants who can pay for their own TI, or at least participate a little bit. One thing that I think I've made clear before, but I'll just make it clear here, there's some very extensive costs that we need to incur to get our civic partners in these spaces. You know, Bezos Academy is during in our negotiations is giving us $1 million to contribute to their space, but their overall space is probably about $4 million. So we're getting in exchange for that $1 million. We're getting about 15 years of tuition-free Montessori education for the community, but it's not for free. It's at an EHA cost and investment to do so. And so one thing we need to be careful about moving forward is making sure that our cost basis in these spaces is reduced a little bit, so there's not too much economic overhang. Because right now we have a very extensive burden of constructing out these retail spaces, constructing out the park, paying for the infrastructure and the roads and utilities, all of which don't have a revenue associated with them. So it's a challenge.
Sure, Andrews, is there a hand up again?
Oh,
I
Commissioner
do,
Andrews?
I do, sorry. I understand Bezos Academy is giving all of this. Has the community actually vetted Bezos as the best education for the students in that area? Do we know what their values are and their teaching? Oh, sorry. Have we taken a look at that? What their educational values are? 'Cause 15 years is a long time to commit to one space if we are not all in line, or if the community is not in line with their educational standards.
They are currently operating out of Everett Station, is that accurate?
Yes.
And so they're pretty successfully operating out of Everett Station. They have an agreement with, I believe it's the City of Everett about that space. And my understanding is that that has been very, very successful. And they're willing to put some skin in the game, you know, which is probably the biggest piece of it. Whether
Yeah,
there's
I also
others that-
recognize that they laid off like most of their senior team at that. So I just want to know if it's going to be sustainable, if they're going to be longstanding, and what their educational standards are for our kids. So I'll take a look at that myself. Thank you.
Yeah, and we can look at it a little bit more too, you know, as we move forward, because we're gonna have to enter into some kind of an agreement with them, so. That's definitely something we can put on our radar.
Yeah, sometimes, okay, thank you. I'll
I mean, one quick thing I'd throw out there is I'm sure the Bezos Academy are quite happy to give the commissioners an overview of their educational pedagogy, and as well as, you know, what they've been working on throughout the United States. I know that they're opening up a lot of different schools across the nation. So I think we could coordinate that, and that could get a lot of your questions answered, Commissioner Andrews. We have reviewed. We've been to their facilities, we've reviewed a lot of their educational practices, but on the same level, we're not educators, we're developers. And so if there's further consideration there, I think it's best that we just do that direct, and we can certainly make that happen.
Thank you.
So a very quick slide. This just gives you an idea of what the kind of central socially engaged core would be. The park looking to the north. This is a view from the north, in essence, from, say, Williams Park side of the property, looking south. Back to why are we doing any of this? The newest housing need is actually higher than this now. It's over 39,000 units, but the city of Everett has a really significant housing need. 39,000 units by 2044. That equates to about 80% of the current housing stock in Everett, which is roughly around 48,000 housing units exist currently in Everett. This is really enormous, and from my own observation will not happen. I don't think that we are set up in the city to deliver this kind of housing this quickly. But it does communicate the amount of need and the challenge we have. The Park District's 1,500 homes, which is a significant investment and a significant number. But it's a very small piece in the much larger puzzle of getting significant amount of housing to Everett.
And I might add to that is, you know, in going through this project with the neighborhood group and with the city of Everett folks, we've had two meetings with Everett City Council, we've had one community meeting. But, you know, that we've gotten so into the details of the project and the concerns of the project that's, you know, there's been this loss of why are we doing this project and the needs of the housing needs within the city of Everett. And that it really is the mission of this organization to provide housing. So we talked a lot about that in the most recent meetings with City of Everett at that city council meeting. And one of the things that we also addressed, because there's been some question is, you know, why are we as a housing authority doing this type of development when the community development community isn't doing this type of development? And you know, my message to the council is in order to meet these numbers and the needs of housing that have been dictated by numbers that they've produced themselves, we need both. We need the type of housing that we can provide as a cost-based housing, and we also need the development community to come in and do similar housing. The other unique thing about this piece of property is we have 16 acres. There's not many 16-acre parcels that can do something this cool, actually, you know, that can do kind of a community-based housing project. So, you know, one thing that the development community, I think you all saw the letter from Craig Scottel regarding the concerns on that project. We have looked at that letter. I have met with Mr. Scotto and talked about this, and you know, I understand where he's coming from a developer standpoint. I definitely understand that, but from a housing authority standpoint, we have two different missions, and they are both needed to provide the housing that's required.
So quick note on what you're looking at on this chart. This chart is illustrating by quarter the amount of deliveries required to meet the housing need. What it's showing is that historically we've never met the housing need, which is why we have the issue that we have. And then it's also showing that any projections, and even if you find our projections low and you want to double our projections, they're still substantially below what the market, what the housing needs to be on a delivery basis to reach the 2044 target. And what you can see and what you can also see in the market is that these deliveries are not happening, and therefore we're falling behind before we've even started on the most current round of projections. So how we get here, just a couple quick slides real quickly, just to show or to illustrate how involved this process has been over the last 3 years, what's been involved in it, and the amount of documentation that is available, which is really substantial, most of which can be found on the City of Everett's Park District website. If you just go to Park District Everett, all of this information is publicly available, and if not, we can provide some extra information. So we originally went through a 1-year master plan process with GGLO just to work on the overall concept. We then moved from there into a determination of which process to use, which ended up being the plan development overlay process, the PDO process, which is similar to a rezone process. We then put together a much larger team. We ended up with a team of about 14, 15 consultants to work on the project. We then went through the environmental process, EIS SEPA process. And then we also worked with a variety of our partners through this process and through the political process to get where we're at. This is a quick run through of a lot of the outreach. I think this shows something like 23 to 25 kind of outreach events. There was more outreach than this, and certainly there's been a lot of outreach just in the last month or so, but it just gives you a kind of holistic view of how extensive the outreach has been through this process, and the amount of engagement that's just required to go through kind of a master plan rezone process such as this. This is just a quick reference to the retail and service opportunities. We touched on this earlier, but this really is a list that was provided by our retail consultant of the types of businesses or retail services that the retail consultant thought would be most likely to be successful in the park district. I'm going to run through a couple of these slides quick, but what this aims to show is where the height in the park district lies. And the important thing to note of these 4 building structures is primarily they're located in areas that are buffered by our existing EHA land holdings and or building structures and or the wetlands. And so from the very beginning, we've been very conscientious about the impact of this building on the neighborhood, and the intent was to place them, as we have successfully done so for the most part, buffering them from the rest of the community. And that just shows you kind of the mid-rise elements. So when we talk high-rise, the zoning capacity is 12 stories. Mid-rise, the zoning capacity is roughly 7 stories to 9 stories, depending on the topography. Typical apartment buildings that you'd see all through the West Coast and all through the kind of Puget Sound area. So this is a quick overview of the investments that we're being held to provide to make this happen. There's about $10,000 of new sidewalks. There's a lot of public utilities. All of the utility infrastructure, using the terms wet and dry, so sewer, water, electrical, all of that needs to be brand new. The park needs to be built out, and it's a lot more extensive than just landscaping. There's a lot of structure that's involved in that park due to the grade. Impact fees are now a little over $6 million from the city. They're separated into 3 particular areas: school, transportation, and parks. Of that, to note, there's about $4 million as transportation, and part of the agreement with the city and with the neighborhood is that the city will credit us for those $4 million or whatever the amounts are for work to be done to provide improvements in the local area. And so the city and we and the neighborhood will be working on some identification of those projects. Largely, that means some new sidewalk work on 15th in areas that are not adjacent to the current Park District project, talking about some sidewalk and some road work on the bend around Baker Street, just around Bakerview, to kind of finish that existing sidewalk and make sure it wraps all the way around the corner. There's also some light work over on 16th that's part of the discussion, and there may be some other projects, but the agreement is that we will take over that work, and whatever cost that work will be credited against our impact fee. We will not be expected to perform more work than as the totality of the impact fee amounts, and that we will do this in phases as we deem suitable to our particular way of delivering the construction.
And that is highly unusual. Cities typically do not take the impact fees for transportation and put them back into the neighborhood where those fees come from. It's highly unusual. And it kind of goes to the credit of the neighborhood association working with the city and with us to look at the impacts in the area and what it's going to do in the lack of sidewalks. So it's a big deal that the city is agreeing to do this. It makes total sense that we do it because we're going to be in the area doing construction already. And so it kind of takes it off their hands, but it won't be a cost to us because we'll be credited back for those dollars. But I can't overstate what a big deal that is. It just does not happen in cities.
The other thing I'd point out real quickly, you may notice in some of our other projects that we don't pay impact fees. Impact fees are not part of the by right kind of zoning process, but because we're going through this PDO process, impact fees are attributed by the city through this particular process. This just gives you a quick overview of some of the public service benefits. In particular, the Bezos Academy is one that is easy to capture. Roughly around $1,500 a month of tuition for up to 100 students capacity. So that's a really significant benefit to the community. I will also note that part of that agreement allows EHA to discern 15% of those tuition seats to persons of our choice. So that could be staff, that could be residents, that could be others. And so we have some discretionary decision-making in the totality of those seats. And then this last slide is just a overview of what Mary and I have been negotiating with the city and the neighborhood. This really is the last 8 items of negotiating pieces. Reduction of the building height through a SEPA interlocal agreement. We agreed in essence to payment of fire and police services up to a particular amount per unit. Those were delayed for 15 years so that we were able to, upon completion of any particular phase, able to get those building structures into a financial situation where they could afford those kind of impact fees / payments for services.
Again, this is a really big deal. We're a tax exempt agency. The only way that, the whole negotiation was really back and forth with City of Everett. We understood the situation that they are in financially, but we also did a lot of pushback because we're a tax exempt agency. There is a way to negotiate this through the SEPA process. I was very concerned that we were going to do something that didn't make any sense from a housing authority perspective. And then needed to be some kind of a nexus so that we weren't giving up something that we have, which is tax exemption, which is a big deal. Through a lot of negotiation back and forth, we did come up with a dollar amount. We spread it, we backed it up. I think they started at 12 years. We went to 15. There was a lot of negotiation on dollar amounts.
Started from zero.
It started from zero. Yeah, we really, my comment to them was, I totally understand where they were coming from the city perspective, because I understand the cost of police and fire. And they also have some financial situations within Everett that they're trying to solve. And so to have this project come, I totally got that perspective. But I think we came to a really good, happy median. They wanted more, we didn't want anything. So I think what we ended up with was a good deal for both. But it is a big deal that we're doing this.
And Commissioner Andrews has her hand raised.
Commissioner Andrews?
Yeah.
Just means our finger sheets a minute.
Oh, sorry, I got caught up in Zoom world here trying to. Question, I have 2 questions. One, I love what we're doing, but I want to make sure that we also can accommodate more of the low income community. So my question is, within the plan of EHA, are we able to allow our voucher clients to apply and live in this space?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Is there a limit on that?
No.
No.
Wonderful. And also, is there a plan that we could move folks and elevate them to this project, freeing up some of our other units to get qualified clients in?
It's just a choice of the residents themselves, within the constraints of the programs.
Yeah, my understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not a housing authority person, but after being in one of our projects for so long, they then can qualify for a voucher. So they basically graduate into the voucher program that then gives them the ability to look at a variety of different options for housing. So this would definitely fit into, moving them forward.
Yeah, that's correct. I would just add on though to say that that doesn't give us new vouchers, it's the same
Right,
pool of vouchers.
right.
So we're, that's when they take that voucher and we backfill that tenancy, then that's one less family we would be housing from our waiting list.
Right.
So
Right.
Right. And for those who are other units, will there be, or will you have conversation at least to think of how we can elevate some of those others that are not on the voucher system to move in this space? It's a question. I don't know if it's even possible, but I would love to see you at least have that conversation.
We can look into that.
Thank you.
So then running through the rest of this list real quickly, I'm a bit sensitive to time, so if I'm rushing and you want to slow me down, feel free, but I'm also going to try to push a little bit so we can get through all of this. Community spaces, there's been a lot of discussion in the neighborhood about community space. More recently, there's been discussion around a teen center, which I understand to be roughly around 3,000 to 4,000 square foot of expected space. I don't anticipate that necessarily to be filled in the first phase, although it's possible. But I think the quick answer to the community and everyone is that we're very engaged to coordinate with others and Boys and Girls Club and the like who can provide those services, and we most certainly will have 3,000 to 4,000 of available space, if not in this first phase, in the second phase, to accommodate that should the service provider be able to make that happen. So it's something we're interested in, but I think also to just park it to reality a little bit. There's a lot of time between now and then, and so we'll be working over the next couple of years to make that happen.
Can we join in some way or another, for lack of better words, with the Boys Club, the Boys and Girls Club, which is right next door,
Yeah.
to take through some?
So we have spent a lot of time talking with the Boys and Girls Club with Bill Toothless, who is I think he's the executive director of the Boys and Girls Club. Bill and I actually go way back. We've worked on a bunch of different projects together. This is the flagship club. This is like club number one. They are very invested in this area. There are ongoing talks about how to do things and plug other funding sources, and also to do something additional in this neighborhood. So it's an ongoing discussion. And I think there's a way to bring a lot of other partners into this. So there is ongoing discussions of this. Some of which we just can't talk about them because they're either so sensitive or they're more conceptual. But if anybody knows Bill, he has the ability to make things happen, more so than pretty much anybody I've ever worked with before. So, and we've also talked a lot with representatives in this area, one of which is Gary Fossey, and potential funding opportunities too. So ongoing discussions.
Residential parking zones, the community was quite concerned about parking and the impact of the park district once it's fully built out. And so the city is taking responsibility to survey the residents, and should there be a sufficient amount of residents who have concerns, establish parking zones in adjacency neighborhoods and blocks. Pedestrian connections, I already mentioned that already. That refers to a lot of the work that EHA will do to assist some of the sidewalks and ADA connections and some other things that are outside a typical scope of work, non-adjacent work, but work that we'll do through a transfer of impact fee credits. Wiggums Park, EHA provided a letter of intent that we do not intend to redevelop that land for housing and or sell it to someone else to redevelop that land as housing. That land, just to remind the commissioners, is part of non-residential public housing. It will require a negotiation with HUD. It most likely will entail some sort of building structure being placed on that land of a recreational nature or the like to be able to negotiate below market value type of land exchange. So there are some complexities to Wiggum's Hollow that I think typically are not well understood in the public, but things that we're trying to manage in terms of expectations. So this will be a work in progress, but we wanted to make clear that we have never wanted to redevelop that land. But we do need to come up with a recreational open space type solution there that makes sense for the community, but also makes sense in relationship to the park district and also the value for which that land holds.
And this letter of intent was really important because the community, the rumor had gotten out there that we were gonna sell it for housing. Or we were putting housing on it, and so it was. And so it was really important that we put that to rest, you know, so the letter of intent on that really kind of settled the neighborhood down, went, okay. We, you know, you put something and signed it, so we're good.
And so that really is the same approach to the set number 7, number 8. So there's a discussion about the wetlands. And so EHA has provided a letter of intent to commit to collaborate with the Boys and Girls Club who owns the wetlands to work with the city of Everett. The city of Everett has stepped up and said that they will ultimately be responsible for that in a collaboration. And so this is work to be done over the next few years, but it's a reinitiation of a discussion that started when I started about 4 years ago about trying to find a solution for the wetlands. So this is real positive, collaborative move forward, and we will start to kind of initiate some work on that in the next year or so once we get our landscape team kind of fully engaged and get the Boys and Girls Club and get City of Everett back to the table with the community to discuss kind of what the larger plans are for the wetlands and in particular how to execute those plans, both in terms of creation as well as just operations. And then the last part here is retail vacancy. There's some concern from the community that there would be vacant retail vacancy. So we just provided a letter of intent to further lay down our commitment to make sure that we work really hard to find retail partnerships. And should we not be able to do so, that we would also help to subsidize or provide some other discounts that would make it more likely for retail partners to be able to engage in those spaces. And then furthermore, should that not be possible, that we would work on aesthetics, graphics, other things, should there be vacant space so that they won't be an eyesore and won't take away from the space.
And this was really important to the elected officials in Everett because they have some empty spaces around town. And no one wants to see empty spaces. So this was really important to the elected officials.
And then last but not least is just the budget. When we came to you before for the park district, we had a budget of about $12.6 million. Part of that includes, as you'll see, demolition. Demolition will be moved to a different authorization, which we will bring to you in upcoming months, probably next month. But this just gives you an overview of what we originally budgeted and where we are right now. So we are under budget, although I will point out that the demolition budget numbers were very old. And when you see the new authorization request for demolition, it will be much closer to around $7.7 to $8 million as opposed to the 3.2 number, which came to us in about 2020. So Ben Young, any last questions around the park district before I move to Ben Young? Nope. So this just gives you a visual of Ben Young Senior Apartments, 140 units, senior housing. I think right now we have roughly around 50 PBV vouchers slotted for this particular project. Just gives you a quick overview of its location in the Port Gardner neighborhood. Pre-existing parcel is the Pacific Stone lot, as well as we purchased 2 houses. If you look actually at the bottom real life aerial of the Pacific Stone site, you'll see a couple blue houses just to the south of kind of the main retail building for Pacific Stone. We purchased those houses a few years ago. And so the future site will extend all the way the entire block. Just some quick facts. Just give everyone a moment to read them. Just a quick kind of architectural focus for all of our projects. We've really spent a lot of time in trying to work through energy code and really provide buildings that have high energy performance. I think that's both important from a resident experience perspective, but it's also very important from a long-term durability perspective as well as a regulatory perspective. Energy code is getting very restrictive in Washington State. Washington has one of the most advanced energy codes in the country. Seattle's is even more advanced, and the future is bringing much more stricture around a lot of these things. And so we've worked really hard to work with consultants to make sure that we're well ahead of current and future code. And we're also putting in systems that will best benefit our residents. In particular, at this site, the residents will also have air conditioning as well as heating, just using new sophisticated heat pump systems, which are very energy efficient. They do add a fair amount of cost, but they do provide long-term savings in terms of energy costs, and they most definitely will increase residents' experience, especially in the hot summer months, especially on the upper floors of the apartment buildings. In addition, there's a lot of amenities beyond that. There's some rooftop decks, there's some storage areas, gardening opportunities, community center room, and the like. There's also a park area to the back of the building, which will also provide some external resources for future residents. This is just a quick overview of anticipated schedule. We're still working on design, still working on underwriting, still working on general deal dynamics, but we're trying to get to a place, and we're also working on funding 1590 funds we just recently applied to, and so we'll get more information on that, whether or not the county will award those to us towards the later end of summer. But we're looking for a construction start in spring 2025, should all these variables align, which would lead us basically to a 2-year build, which would be a 2027 opening. Just going to run through a quick slides. We'll give you a quick overview. So the black section is the building on the lower floor, parking is behind, and then there's a little kind of cutout, what we call dado park, behind the parking. So just give you a few different angles of the facade. You can see from there, you can see solar panels on the top of the roof. You can see a couple rooftop deck areas for residents, the upper floor outside the community room. You can also see the relative placement of the building relative to the other neighbors. We've worked really hard to try to create an environment in which we weren't too oppressive on the surrounding single family. At the same time, we're efficient with our development capacity so we could take best advantage of the site. Just gives you an idea of what the parking lot will look like in the back with the park. And the single family residences, there's quite a large gradient change from there to the houses up on top. So some trees and some other things will really make a difference in terms of separation. Just a quick rendering of anticipated unit types. This is a pretty rough rendering, so these won't be precise, but give you a rough idea. This would be downstairs at the entry area. Elevators.
What was the square footage of that unit?
I don't know. There's a variety of square footages in the unit type. Most of the square footages go from around 550 to roughly 800 square feet as a general range. And then we had already submitted for authorization to the board a pre-development budget of $7.57 million, which was actually came in a few authorizations. One was, a couple were for the land, and then the other was for the pre-development budget. This just gives you a remaining balance of 1.5 million left. We don't expect to come for authorization until we come for final financing kind of omnibus authorization, which would come at the end of this pre-development period and prior to construction. And that's it. So I would love to answer any questions out there, and I can certainly move back to any slides that would be requested to see in a second time.
I can only tell you how excited it is to be part of this project.
Yeah.
This is.
Yeah. There's a lot of excitement around this project too.
Yeah, I hear a lot of talk. I hear
Yeah.
a lot of talk also.
There's a lot. One of the things that I have,
Commissioner Trainer?
Sorry, I'm
Sorry.
on my phone in my car, so. Jason, thanks for all the information on both those projects. My question to you is about the Ben Young project, and is it too early to, have you already done an MOU with any of the builders, or is it still early in the process for that?
Yeah, we a long time ago brought on BMB early on in the
Okay.
process for pre-construction. So BMB Builders is a contractor.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that.
You bet.
I might just mention that, one of the things that I've heard, and I'm interested to have learned more and more about how we've gone into this whole development phase and how do you fund these and the outside funding sources and the investment groups. And so we're gonna be providing some education for the board on that. I've heard that from like several board members, and I'm interested in hearing, okay, so we have these projects now, how do we fund them? Yeah. I think that would be really, really helpful for everybody.
If I could just say one little comment as relates to that, and we'll do this in an educational, I think just big picture as trying to think about this, there's one side of how we fund it, but when we say funding, I think sometimes we're maybe not specific enough with that word. Fundamentally, we either have money ourselves, which would be the best scenario. In our case, we don't have a lot of money lying around. And so that is just one challenge we deal with, which our own equity resources are fairly limited and constrained. So we need to get creative to deal with that challenge. Secondarily, there are a variety of funding sources out there that we can have access to, but it's also important to recognize that many of those have also fairly significant constraints. And so they're not always as valuable sources as you might think once you read through the dotted lines and figure out what kind of constraints you're also adding onto yourself. And so that's another calculation that plays into a lot of our approach to looking into different funding mechanisms and resources. And then one of the largest elements of this really has to do with the market itself. And that has to do with where rents are at, that has to do with interest rates are at, that happens to do where tax credit pricing is at in any particular year or location, geographical location. And then it just also has to do with kind of supply demand fundamentals. And right now in Everett, as traditional, one of the things we struggle with is that Everett really suffers from kind of what I call geographical arbitrage, which is the construction costs in Seattle, the general costs in Seattle, operational costs, in Everett are the same as in Seattle and Bellevue, but our rents are much lower, which means fundamentally the city of Everett struggles to supply housing because there's not a very good reason for most developers to develop in Everett when you can develop in Shoreline or you can develop somewhere else where the land is similarly priced, but the reward is much higher. And so that's just, I say that out loud because when we go through these educational processes further forward, there's a lot of issues about funding, capital markets and the rest, but one of the most fundamental aspects of this really is the market side of it. It's the supply and demand, it's the rents, the revenue, our ability to create revenue for some of these projects. And on the flip side, it's interest rates and cost of capital. And because we borrow so much, we're a highly leveraged debt user of capital to pay for these projects, we are very, very sensitive to interest rates. And we have a challenge right now, which is not alone, because all developers out there have the same challenge right now, which is interest rates are not calibrated well, meaning the cost of capital is not calibrated to the other variables that matter a lot, which is kind of your net income characteristics and your construction costs, which still remain high. And so as we move forward, I'll provide as transparent of information as I can, but I think it's useful to keep that in mind. When we speak of challenges, those are the challenges we're dealing with kind of daily to try to figure out pathways to resolve them. I think Cynthia, Commissioner Andrews, have your hand up.
Thank you. Yes, I do. With the significant amount of people that we are bringing into these communities, are we working with waste management to talk about sustainability plans for waste and becoming more waste-free or environmentally friendly?
Yes, so when we design these buildings, we do discuss with the city and waste management, in this case, Rubenco, or no, sorry. Rubatino, that's my Seattle mishap there. We do coordinate with them just to coordinate planning, because one of the real big issues in apartment buildings is just where do you put basically the trash and how do you manage recycling, how do you separate? So they have their own rules and regulations of which we coordinate with, and so the staff would be coordinating with them on that. And then once we get the building closer into operation, we would then be meeting with them again to work through kind of site logistics and any best practices, which would include kind of recycling considerations.
I'd love to suggest that we do something more innovative, since we have so many and you can apply those standards to the units. But maybe look at some composting and some other projects that we can just help keep waste down.
You will find very deep alignment with our development staff.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the commissioners? Okay, well, thank you so much for putting time and energy into sharing this information with us. So it looks like next on the agenda is items for individual consideration, which we have none. But, oh, I skipped one, approval of minutes. We had a couple that had to drop, I think. Do we still have quorum? Yeah, we do.
Yes, yes.
So now we're gonna do an approval of the minutes for the regular meeting held on June 24th, 24, special meeting held on June 26th, 2024 at the same time. So I would need a motion from one of the commissioners.
I would move for approval.
Do I have a second? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Not hearing any. Approvals of the minutes are approved. And as I said earlier, no individual consideration items. And so now we're at the adjournment. So do I have a motion during the meeting? Any motion to adjourn the meeting?
Motion.
Second.
All just,
All did.
and I'll second
Okay, all in favor? All in favor?
Aye.
it. Aye.
Okay, any opposed? No?
Okay.
Okay.
It was great seeing all of you.
Yes,
Take
your
care.
time.
Thank you. Have
Yeah.
a good day.